much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd kind of like to start out just quoting a couple little phrases here to certainly underscore my feeling on this. Is I think the chairman said that this is enormous. This has enormous complexity, and I think the ranking member said that online internet advertising plays an indispensable role. I think those are pretty powerful statements in terms of what we're trying to do here. The internet has been a marvel. It's created all kinds of economic activity, certainly improved people's lives. So we need to understand how enormously complex this situation is, and it's not easy. And the analogy I would use in terms of crime, because we're talking about criminal activity and who's going to be held liable for it. I mean, the analogy I'd use would be, let's say you have a criminal that even though you have safeguards in a taxi cab, that criminal defeats those safeguards, takes over the cab, and kills somebody. I mean, is the cab company to be held liable for that criminal activity? I think that's probably a more accurate analogy that we're talking about here. So I think the purpose of this hearing is what can government potentially do to help it? And, you know, I think I know who Yahoo is. I think I know who Google is. I think I know how you guys, obtain revenue and make money. I'm not too sure about OTA, and there are a couple things that have surprised me in terms of the comments you've made. So let me first ask you, Mr. Spiesel, who are you? Where do you get your funding? How do you obtain revenue?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to provide clarity. So the OTA, the Online Trust Alliance, got founded, quite frankly, actually in 2003, 2004 as a working group to address and bring forward the anti-spam standards that Yahoo referenced in their original testimony there through a collaborative effort. And it was in recognizing...
Who funded that effort? I mean, it takes money to do that. Who funded it?
That effort was through companies like Symantec, Microsoft, PayPal, lots of companies that came together, Cisco.
So do you continue to get funding that way, or do you get funding in other ways?
So our funding actually comes from multiple, again, we're a 501c3, we're not a trade organization. We look across the ecosystem. We have a diverse group of sponsors and contributors, as well as we've received grants from DHS and others. So again, our mission is very clear. We support advertising, but again, our most important part is improving consumer trust and the vitality of the internet.
Okay, because here's what sent bells and whistles going off in my head, and I'm not sure I heard you say it, but the chairman said that you talked about the fact that Yahoo and Google have little incentive to do what?
So the point,
is that, first of all, is that an accurate statement? So what do they have little incentive to do?
So I think in the context of the question, if I can clarify about incentive, it's incentive of data sharing. It's really an industry issue that we've been trying to get people to work on together. And the incentive is data sharing.
Do you deny the fact that Google and Yahoo have a enormous free market incentive to make sure that this criminal activity doesn't occur on the networks?
I think as dominant market players, there's a responsibility and how the lack of data sharing and how it's marginalizing the ecosystem
but answer the question. Doesn't Yahoo and Google, don't they have enormous financial incentives to try and police this and prevent maladvertising and malware?
As they've suggested, malvertising is a small % of the overall ad industry, and so to add the operational friction and to change it is a major change in how they operate today.
You're still not answering the question.
I don't think there is.
You really do not think Yahoo or Google have an enormous financial incentive to try and police this stuff and prevent it from happening?
I think they do, whether they are.
Okay, good. That's what I wanted to, because here's the point. What can government do better than what these private companies can do to prevent this? I've sat through hearing after hearing. For example, just this week, we talked about the Defense Department, who has been unable to get audit ready in 15 to 20 years. So my point is there a role the government can play that's constructive, if you hear me out?
Yes, please.
That doesn't actually do more harm than good. Now, as I've been investigating this and been involved in Commerce Committee hearings, the first step we need to take in terms of cybersecurity is information sharing. And the only way we're going to get information sharing is we have to provide some liability protection. I mean, I want to ask all three of you, is that pretty much the first thing the government has to do? We have to enact some type of information sharing piece of legislation that provides kind of liability so that you will actually share information. Let me start with Mr. Stamos.
Thank you, Senator. We're in support of information sharing as long as there are strong privacy protections for our users, but we're happy to work on the details of that, yes.
Do you think that's the first step?
I think that's an important step. I also think something government can do right now is to work on the disrupting the financial side of these cybercriminal networks.
So you're actually talking about enforcement. You're talking about going after the criminals and enforcing and penalizing the criminals.
Yeah, yes, penalizing the criminals, but also just making it hard for them to make money. A lot of these guys are actually selling products. They're taking credit cards. They're cashing checks. And so even if we can't arrest them because they're in a jurisdiction where that's impossible, we can make it difficult for them to profit off of targeting Americans.
So would that require more regulation in the banking industry? I mean, some targeted actions there?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the exact. I think this is all already illegal. It's really just a focus issue.
Okay, Mr. Salem, again, what can government do? What's the first step?
Senator, you had mentioned, basically looking at, being able to allow information. To be quite clear, my team is the one at Google that does the anti-malvertising. And we're very happy that we can actually speak to our colleagues, at least in the industry, very openly about the different threats and what we can do about it. We actually currently do talk very openly, and in, some of the other threats that have come out, like, we've spoken recently about trustandads.org, where you have scams basically in the tech support industry. These were terrible for consumers. Some of them had malware installed on their computers under the guise of giving a credit card number to people in India, helping them on their computer. We're very happy to discuss.
Okay, but that's between companies. What about information sharing with the government, so the government can disseminate some of that information to other people in the industry that you maybe don't have a partnership with? And then I guess the other thing I want to get to is some sort of federal preemption on data breach. So we have a data breach standard, so you're not having to deal with 50 or more, potentially hundreds or thousands of jurisdictions. I mean, is that something pretty important? Is that something the government can do that'd be constructive as opposed to hampering your activities?
Yes, it would.
Because here's my concern, is that we enact some piece of legislation with the best of intentions that actually makes it more difficult, takes your eye off the ball of actually solving the problem, as opposed to complying with regulations that, I'm sorry, are written by people that aren't even close to as agile and as flexible and as knowledgeable as what your companies are.
Yeah. Currently today, we are able to, do our scanning, look for these bad ads, look for sites and protect consumers, protect our users, talk to other folks in the industry, currently about malvertising, about the malvertising trends. Right now, we do not feel like we have problems or that there's anything encumbering us with this communication for the issue of malvertising.
Okay, part of my concern about some of the answers you're providing in the hearing here is you obviously don't want to alarm your consumers, and and that may, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm a little concerned that that's why you're saying, well, no, this is a small slice. I mean, this is a big problem, right? And I want you to kind of answer the question I asked Mr. Spiesel about the enormous incentives you have. I mean, you mentioned, I think in your testimony, a top priority is users matter. User trust, user security is a top priority. I mean, I think that just makes common sense, but I'll give you an opportunity to underscore that point.
For Google, user privacy, user security is number one. I mean, honestly, we are an internet business. Our users are one click away from going to our competition, or one click away from doing something else. We have to prove to them that we take this seriously, that when they click on any ad, that it's a safe ad, and that when, we deal with our third-party advertisers, that they are vetted partners as well.
Yes, Senator, we have a huge incentive to maintain user trust. The biggest sites that Yahoo ads run on are Yahoo sites. And so to maintain those 800 million people around the world using our sites, we have to maintain the trust of our users, and we have to live up to our responsibilities.
Now, I come from a manufacturing background, so we've gone through ISO certification, which I'll have to admit, when I first got into it, I'm going, well, this is a pretty good deal for the consultants that do ISO certification. But having gone through the process, I became a real believer that this is extremely helpful in terms of providing, not only my company the tools to get our process under control, but to communicate to our customers, to our suppliers, that we had our process under control across a whole host of different parts of that standard. From my standpoint, that kind of certification process would make sense for this particular, when we're talking about standards, security standards and advertising. Is that something that Yahoo, Google would support? Some kind of third-party certification process that would give consumers the comfort that the standards are in place.
Thank you, Senator. I think we would support self-regulation to set guidelines. From the actual technical standards, this is something that we change and innovate on every single day. So we need to be really careful to not get too prescriptive to where we're living up to a rule and we're not doing what we need to do to keep.
Well, that's why I'm talking about a private sector
Yes.
alternative, but I want to make sure it's a cooperative one, not potentially somebody who's set up in business and is actually hostile to some of the actors in the room. You really need to have this very cooperative, very flexible, very fast-moving, because these standards are going to have to change what? Daily?
Yes.
I mean, literally, what are we talking about in terms of the level of flexibility we're going to need if we're going to have any hope? And all we're going to be able to do is minimize this, right? Probably. I mean, the criminal is going to be one step ahead of us every time. You're going to have to continue to change these standards and what we need to do on an ongoing basis, correct?
Correct. We need to evolve, and we need to basically be as nimble as possible to make sure that we are one step ahead of those criminals.
I might add,
I'm out
like
of time.
the standards that were addressed earlier, that the industry came together to address spam and deceptive email, DMARC and DKIM and SPF. They're examples of similar technologies that could be employed. So I actually say that there could be standards that could be developed that could help increase the trustworthiness in advertising.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.